We were happy children. Happy children from happy families, living in a cozy and small countryside village, our lives tranquil and simple. A paradise I didn't even know I was living in. I couldn't properly appreciate. I had no knowledge of death, pain, misery, or tragedy. Within this perfect bubble, the only fact of life was that joy never ends. Riley and I were best friends. We hanged out together nearly every day, mostly exploring the forest, located not too far off from where we lived. We played hide and seek together, sneaking behind the tall white trees, played tag in the ever expanding meadow we found one day when we ventured further and further until we reached the forest's end. We jumped through the small stream flowing through, and fell in plenty too. We had our cool base spots where we spent our summer vacations building forts from sticks, knots, and leaves. I think we climbed every tree that made it possible, one so tall it gave us a breathtaking view of the bushy treetops, our peaceful village, the ethereal meadow blending in with the tall mountains in the distance. Well, I say we, but I never had the guts. Riley was always the one better at climbing and had a tad bit more courage and trust in the trees themselves, that they would not break under her. She made sure to at least describe it all to me, after failing to convince me too many times. Her description was vivid enough that I never felt like I missed out on anything, and to this day, I remember. I remember we knew everything about that forest, and everything beyond. Just like my parents knew Riley's, my grandparents knew her grandparents, grand-grandparents knew her grand-grandparents, my grand-grand-grandparents knew hers, and so on. Just like you could fit all of the village kids in one classroom, just like I knew all of them and all of our families knew each other. We were a small, tight-knit community, with nothing ever changing, and after years, the former secret the forest held for us disappeared too. Instead, it became our old friend, and every time we found our way in, it would hug us, always warm, always welcoming. That sense of mystery would come back to bite us one day, new, exciting, as we were heading to one of our forts. We found a path, somewhat abandoned, but still noticeable. Though confused as how we never saw it before, we were quickly overwhelmed with the need to forge it anew and find out where it's headed. There was no need to be worried or wary. We were happy children from a village where nothing bad has ever happened. It was our first time seeing a cemetery. We didn't even know what that place was called until we asked around the adults. I vaguely remember the surprise, even displeasure they expressed when I voiced my curiosity. That graveyard appeared as a battlefield on which the graves lost their battle against time. Erosion and nibbling and gnawing on their gnarly surfaces, many of them half concrete and half moss, which cracked and wormed its way through. Some had stains of wax on them and stray matches, a vague memory of candles whose light went out an eternity ago. It was like the forest itself wanted to forget them. Those people, their lives, with headstones enveloped by bushes and small trees, the carvings withered down to remain unreadable. The cross statue in the center was more of a crutch for a young tree snaking around and sprouting through. As a whole, the graveyard was sinking, wallowing in decay on a slow, painful decline towards the soil. We were happy children, and lucky ones too, for one mystery led to another. Going through the cemetery, curious with our hands and thoughts and conversations, exchanging a lot of elated question marks, we stumbled upon a glaring anomaly. Smooth, uninterrupted concrete, perfectly pristine. A grave that looked eerily out of place, out of time. The cross carved on the headstone was fresh and sharp, and the words spoke to us as clear as the daylight illuminating them. For death is unavoidable and will always come. I've seen roses before, all kinds. Deep crimson, stark orange, happy yellow, rosy pink. Yet, there it was, lying perfectly in the heart of our gravely mystery, a rose so dark it swallowed all the light reaching towards it. For the first time together, we were both rendered speechless. After a sufficient time of intense staring had passed, I broke the deafening silence. Have you ever seen a rose like this one? No, never, like ever. How can it be completely black? Flowers aren't supposed to be black, ever. Maybe it's a fake one. As Riley dropped on one knee to investigate, a sudden wave of uneasiness washed over me. A primal instinct overwhelmed my mind, and with an unexplained urgency drove my body to stop her hand from reaching the flower. I wasn't thinking. She turned her gaze towards me, head cocked to the side with loud confusion. I had moments where I was too scared to do something Riley wanted to do, but I've never stopped her before, not until now. That image of her, large green eyes, radiating in harmony with surrounding nature, her small lips slightly ajar, strands of light brown hair framing her youthful face, hugging her shoulders, messy, alive, cheeks slightly flushed and skin gently kissed by the sun. She was always the more courageous one, and with the trust of a child that has never had anything bad happen to them. She shook my hand off and picked up the black rose, admired it, touched it, smelled it to confirm that it's real. You should put it back, I pleaded after a long while passed by, with a look of someone so immersed they are long departed from here and now. She kept on, admiring, touching, smelling. It terrified me, more and more as time passed. It was as if the whole place dropped an enormous weight onto my shoulders and my legs wanted to run to save themselves. I've given it all, to sound as stern as my parents scolding when I come back home late. Riley! Huh? I've managed to create a moment of carelessness, and that was enough for her to drop it. I was glad. With that, I finally made her get the rose back where it came from and dragged us both from the cemetery and forest itself. It was getting dark. I practically ran. I've never experienced such unexplainable fear and dread ever in my life, and I wanted out. I wanted to get back to the same village with happy families and happy lives where nothing bad ever happens. The first time I got to see her after that was when Riley was wearing a black dress, along with her whole family, along with our whole village. I had my father's spare black tie along with the formal suit I've slightly outgrown. Hand me down, I don't know where it came from. Grandmother, they said. 108 years old. From that day on, Riley came to intimately understand tragedy. Like a crushing tide, the deaths came down raining. Grandfather fell from his own bedroom window and impaled himself on the tree below. Too much whiskey, his heartbroken wife said. Grandaunt poisoned herself on rotten food and vomited blood so violently it sent her to a coma she never woke up from. Grandmother fell not so long ago after her husband. Her mourning drove her to stab her own chest while preparing a meal she usually would for her deceased lover. After her third funeral, I followed her to our forest. Her mourning drove us apart for a long time, and I wanted to be there for her. I missed the happy times we had in our happy forest, our old friend. Passing the threshold, it was no longer a warm hug that greeted me. It was a cold push, commanding me that either I go in or out. It was sure old. Friend, I wasn't sure of anymore. The path leading to the cemetery was no longer abandoned. Freshly paved with Riley's dainty footprints, it also reeked freshly of death. Damning my distaste for the place, I tailed behind her, her dark attire stark in value compared to the washed out grass. I found her sitting beside the new graves of her relatives, blooming with all sorts of flowers, yet none black roses in sight. That one damned anomaly has disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only destruction and my best friend with a curse. Those tears she shed on the first funeral have long dried out. Riley just looked exhausted this time. Exhausted to the depth of her soul. I've sat beside her, not knowing if she will even notice me. I'm sorry, Riley. Thanks, Briar. Did you find it? Not yet. I don't even think it's here anymore. The damned rose was obviously gone. I felt stupid for even asking, but she said that with so much pity, it startled me. Do you want to find it? A long, solemn silence befell us as I cursed myself internally for asking again. I fixated on her face as her eyes, lifeless and dull, grey in harmony with the bleak world and cloudy sky, get lost in the distance. Her lips slightly ajar, this time all cracked and bitten. Washed out brown locks framed her cold porcelain skin, perfectly straight and tired. I feel so empty, she began with a whisper nearly lost in the wind. I think that rose will make me whole again. There have been many funerals since. Each death is more brutal and devastating than another. Granddad died doing what he loved. The sight he left behind for his wife was grotesque, with meat, bone, and brain matter spread out like a terrible painting on the wooden walls of his shed. The painter, circular saw, too old to have working safety measures in place. His wife cut her own foot off using an old, rusty hoe while gardening. And while she managed to treat it herself at first, her wound ended up infected multiple times, and after 2 weeks of intense battle, she lost. Granduncle got to kiss a wall on his motorcycle while going 130 kilometers per hour. No amount of braking would be able to save him. The collision left him and his motorcycle unrecognizable. The only identifying piece of him left were a set of fingers, one with his engagement ring still on. Great-grandaunt, not much of a daredevil, was much rather into combing baths. One day, it calmed her so much she fell asleep. She slowly slumped down, deeper and deeper, and as she was a heavy sleeper, not even water invading her lungs could interfere with her slumber. It wasn't the only case of drowning. Uncle's body was not long after found floating around the village river, leaving a bloody trail behind. It is unclear what happened to him, as he went fishing a few days prior, but never returned home. Aunt didn't take the news well. She wandered all around the river every day, as if to hope to reunite with her husband, and after a short time went missing. And just like him, they found her dead, cruising at roughly the same place Grandmother and grandfather had an old house with old electrical sites, which one fateful evening malfunctioned and set it all ablaze in a matter of moments. The bodies the firefighters managed to drag out were left rather as pieces of charcoal, disfigured beyond saving. Through the passage of time, I came to notice all sorts of worrying changes in Riley, growing more and more concerning each time I got to see her. At her grandfather's funeral, I noticed that her skin, still pale, came to have a subtle yet odd tinge of green, like mold. At her father's funeral, the green tinge became more prominent, this time accompanied with green veins crawling through her skin like snakes. At her brother's funeral, her nails had grown black and strangely pointy, and I could swear she left a trail of leaves in her wake everywhere she went. Her mother's funeral was the moment I saw black petals trailing right behind her every step. That sight left me mortified. Yet, I could never reach her, never find her. Riley's misery has reached to the point where it led her an absolute orphan, and yet she never came to see me. Both worried and hurt by her sudden absence, I've made my mission to find her whatever it takes. Riley was declared missing. That destructive storm which seemingly had no end, that wail of death and mourning that is too heavy to brush off. It rampaged and rampaged so much that many didn't even notice the girl disappearing. The village, once never-changing pillar of happiness and stability, came crushing down, and as it rained and rained and rained, everyone became so soaking wet they didn't even notice another downpour. Numb. An epidemic I barely avoided by still craving that happiness. By missing Riley. I admit my guilt. My shame. I knew where to find her. All that time she was missing. I just didn't know if I could even manage again. She was the more courageous one. The trail towards the cemetery was well known, well loved. I had to remind myself of Riley. Happy Riley from a happy village where nothing bad ever happens. I found her crouching on the grave, one that was gone the last time I dared to step on this damned ground. Worried and wary, I approached her small hunched figure, something sounding an alarm deep inside my gut. Yet, I stepped forward, inching closer and closer. This time, I had to be the courageous one. I sat down beside her. Her face was still turned away from me when she spoke to me, with a tone that made me shiver. Briar. Peace. Eerie peace. I froze in cold terror when she finally turned towards me, and I couldn't help myself but to stare. I couldn't even blink. Through her hands, through her abdomen, chest, face, through her whole being, crawling in and out like thousands of green snakes, invading her black dress, her skin along with leaves and thorns, eating, biting, tearing everything apart like an animal with insatiable appetite. Wounds too many to count, dry blood clinging to each one, smudged all over like a cracked paint on a canvas, one that had been impaled thousands of times, over and over again. Thousands of stems, sprouting through, wild and free, feasting on her withered out body. Her chest appeared the most infested, stems twisting all around, smothering her, growing inside her ribcage, meat all around half consumed. Where the heart used to beat, bloomed a black rose, as vibrant as darkness itself can be. Like a plague, the sprouts led their way towards her face, and her eyes. Only one was looking back at me, as her other one was replaced by another deep, dark rose in full blossom. Surrounded by violent violet and rotting red, it cried bloody tears, fresh and still dripping. She caressed the gaping darkness on her chest with her leafy, bloody fingers when she took a feeble breath and spoke to me. I'm finally whole again. Locked in a stare there was no backing up from, she slowly, almost menacingly plugged her second rose straight from her eye, leaving behind an empty, bloodied eye socket. When I finally realized what she was doing, that intense terror that froze me in place made me jump up instead. She was offering me, asking me a question, one that I could only respond with a horrified no. She kept her outstretched hand steady, with the black rose dripping with red ink still, as she said, peaceful, "You'll regret it." I sure did. I ran out of there the instant my survival instinct fully kicked in, and yet that didn't spare me. My grandfather shot himself right in the face while taking care of his gun, blowing up his head into smithereens. My grandmother spilled liters of scorching hot oil on her face, chest, stomach, pelvis and hands, leaving damage so severe she suffered through every moment before she inevitably succumbed to the third-degree burns. Grandfather contracted the brain-eating amoeba while trying to take care of an old pond he found. To this day, I can hear his blood-curdling screams piercing through my ears for hours when we were behind a glass wall of the hospital, trying to be there for him in his last moments. In that same hospital, they diagnosed my grandmother with bacterial meningitis after her symptoms weren't going away. She was dead within days. Grandmother got caught up in a storm while hunting for mushrooms deep in the mountains. The lightning struck her when she was frantically trying to search for shelter. Grandfather went to look for her when he saw the vitriol outside, never coming back. We found him later with my grandmother, and they weren't even that far apart. Lightning struck twice, never allowing them to reunite again. So close, yet so far. My mother stroked out behind the wheel on her way home, crashing on the nearest tree. Her dismembered body parts were scattered on the highway, impaled with shards of our disintegrated car. My father blew his brains out when he came home from the mortuary. Too many funerals. I couldn't even wash my dirty, sweaty suit. So much tragedy, all at once, waves of horror and misery drowning me in and out, drenching me to the very core of my being. A core that sank more and more into a large, gaping, empty hole in my chest, with nothing to fill it. Grief and tragedy, a world so removed from the one I spent exploring with Riley, spent laughing with my family, her family, our happy, safe village. That village, that forest, all came to be drenched and rancid with blood, each day pouring, dripping, still fresh, still empty. I can't handle being empty anymore. The forest welcomes me this time. My grief reflected in it, gentle. An old, dying friend. The path to the cemetery is well known, well loved. No feeling of dread or fear could win over the misery that led me here. I walked towards the anomaly we found when we first came here, this time even stranger than I would expect. I found the body of a happy girl from an unhappy village. More plant than a body, sinking and growing inside the ground, Riley was still smiling, somehow not disfigured enough for me to not recognize. A sight that should elicit sheer horror. Yet, now I am able to see what I couldn't. Peace. In her hand, she still cradled that rose she offered me not long ago. The fact is, no amount of survival instinct could make me run away from the only known salvation from this ravenous hunger. No amount of horror, nausea, disgust, fear. I hunch over. Caressing her fingers, I pry it out. Riley's blood, still fresh, still dripping. I accept. Riley's blooming black rose. Well, hello there, my friend. First, I must commend you for making it to the end. This video is my first, along with my first attempt at a creepypasta story, so have mercy for any imperfections you may notice. Everybody has to begin somewhere, demons included. This video was formerly made to be a Halloween special. Unfortunately, it didn't work out as I'd hoped to. With that out of the way, I believe it is time for a brief introduction. My name is Mr. Byrne, or Diabolo, whichever you prefer. I am a former demon, currently occupying a human body and trying to live a human life, finding joy in the act of creation. If drawing, writing, stories, OCs and things of that nature piqued your interest, you may be at the right place. Who knows what this endeavor will truly devolve into? I'm not really sure myself. In any case, I once again thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the experience and have a desire for more in the future, you can reward me with a like and a subscribe button. Entirely optional, no pressure. Have a nice rest of your existence. Bye!